My daughter rang at 7:14 in the morning to tell me the cruise was still happening. What she forgot to mention was that my name was no longer on the passenger list. I had already paid for every cabin. So I called the cruise line, introduced myself as the sole account holder, and requested a full cancellation. They were somewhere over the Atlantic when the ship's concierge informed them that their staterooms no longer existed. That is how it ended. Let me tell you how it began. My name is Dorothy May Callaway. I am 64 years old, and I have lived in Savannah, Georgia, for most of my life. I spent 31 years as a registered nurse at Memorial Health. The kind of work that teaches you early that the human body is fragile, that time is not promised, and that the people who show up at 3 in the morning are the ones who truly love you. My husband Robert showed up every single time. When I worked double shifts, he left soup on the stove with a note that said, "Warm this before midnight, or I will worry." He drove 40 minutes in a rainstorm to bring me dry shoes when a pipe burst in the break room. When our daughter was born, he cried in a way I had never seen a man cry before. Not out of weakness, out of wonder. Robert passed away 4 years ago. A heart attack that came without warning on a Tuesday afternoon. He was in the garden when it happened. I found him beside the rosebush he had planted the year we moved in. His hand was still holding the pruning shears. After he was gone, I made a promise to myself, the quiet kind that doesn't require witnesses. I would take our family on the trip he had always talked about. A cruise, a big one. Robert used to fold down the corners of travel magazines and circle itineraries with a red pen. It nanisi, wendo kind, wendo kades, think about Caribbean routes mostly. He wanted to stand on a deck and watch the sun melt into the water. He never got the chance, so I made it my mission. I started setting money aside the month after his funeral, not in the jar. Robert had always told me to be smarter than that. So I opened a dedicated savings account I called the Family Voyage Fund. £200 moved into it every month, without fail. When I started picking up extra nursing shifts at the clinic downtown, every penny of that went into the account too. I clipped coupons for the weekly shop. I stopped having my hair colored at the salon and bought the box instead. I wore the same winter coat for 3 years, even when the lining started to separate at the seams. Little sacrifices, invisible to everyone but me. By the time I had enough, I had saved a little over £19,000. I rang a travel agent named Pauline, a woman I had known since our children were at school together, and I told her I wanted to book a 7-night Caribbean cruise for 12 people. 2 families, 1 reunion. My daughter and her husband, their 3 children, my son-in-law's parents, my son and his girlfriend, my great-aunt Cecile, who was 81 years old and had never left the state of Georgia, and me. Pauline helped me book 3 connecting staterooms and 1 balcony cabin, which I reserved for Cecile because she deserved the view more than anyone. I paid the deposit in full that same afternoon. I organized the flight connections from 2 different cities. I arranged a van transfer from the port. I bought matching luggage tags in navy and gold that said Callaway Family Voyage 2005. I posted them to each family with a handwritten note. I had never felt more like Robert was watching me from somewhere good. What I did not know was that while I was planning the trip of our lives, my daughter had been planning something else entirely. The first sign came at Easter dinner. My daughter and her husband had driven up from Brunswick, and we were sitting around the table when her husband mentioned, very casually, that his sister was thinking of taking a cruise that summer. My daughter smiled at the tablecloth. She did not look at me. I noticed, but I said nothing. I am the kind of woman who gives people the room to explain themselves before assuming the worst. The second sign came 3 weeks later. I rang to confirm dietary requirements for the booking. When I mentioned adding a gluten-free note for my daughter's youngest, she paused just a beat too long and said, "Oh yes, right, the cruise, go ahead." as if I had called to remind her of an appointment she had half forgotten. The third sign I missed completely. That one is the one I think about now. It was a Sunday afternoon, 6 weeks before departure. I was on the porch sorting through the final confirmation documents. My phone buzzed with a text from my daughter. It said, "Mom, just a heads up. Marcus's sister ended up booking the same ship." Small world. I replied with a heart emoji and went back to my papers. I should have asked. The message that changed everything came on a Wednesday evening at 20 to 10. I remember the time because I had just finished watching the news and was about to turn off the kitchen light. My phone lit up on the counter. She wrote, "Mom, I've been meaning to talk to you about this and I know it's late, but I didn't know how to bring it up sooner. Marcus's sister Renee booked the same cruise and she's bringing her family. There are only so many connecting rooms on that deck, and we've been thinking it would be so much nicer for the kids to have both cousins together. It would just flow better if Renee's family took the rooms you booked for us and your side of things. You understand, don't you? You're always so understanding. It's not a big deal. You'll still be there. It's just reorganized." I read that message 4 times. The first time brought confusion. The second brought a cold, spreading clarity. The third brought something that sat low in my chest, like a stone dropped into still water. The fourth time, I set the phone face down on the counter, walked slowly to Robert's armchair in the living room, and sat in it the way I used to when I needed to feel him near me. Reorganized. She had called it reorganized. What she meant was that I had been moved, not uninvited, shuffled to the edge of the trip I had designed, funded, and dreamed into existence for 4 years. Her husband's sister and her husband's sister's children would take the staterooms I had chosen and paid for, and I was supposed to understand. Because I was always so understanding, I did not call her that night. I did not text back. Instead, I walked to the kitchen, opened my laptop, and pulled up the cruise line's passenger management portal. Pauline had given me the login credentials as the primary account holder. I scrolled through the booking summary. 12 passengers, 3 staterooms, 1 balcony cabin, all under Dorothy May Callaway, all paid, all mine. Then I opened a new document and began making a different kind of list. I thought about Gloria from my old nursing unit, who had retired the same year I did and spent most of her days at the food bank, because she once told me it gave her somewhere to go. I thought about my neighbor Ruth, who had raised 4 children alone, and whose youngest had moved away without leaving a forwarding address. I thought about my friend Hazel from church, who turned 70 last year, and celebrated alone because she said she didn't want to make a fuss, which everyone in the congregation knew meant nobody had offered to make a fuss for her. I thought about Lynn, who had been my closest friend at the hospital for 15 years, and who told me once over lunch that she had never in her adult life taken a holiday that was just for her. I thought about my great-aunt Cecile, who I had already booked the balcony cabin for, who had sent me a voice message when she received her luggage tag that made me have to sit down, because I was not prepared for the sound of an 81-year-old woman crying because someone had thought to include her. I wrote their names in a column. A. Ruth, Hazel, Azel, Ale. One more name came to me. By their names in a column. My cousin, who had been my bridesmaid, who had cared for her mother through dementia for 6 years without a single trip out of her home county. 6 names, 6 women who had spent decades showing up for everyone else. I saved the document. Then I went to bed, not because I was uncertain, but because I am the kind of woman who believes the most important decisions deserve one night of silence before they are carried out. In the morning, I rang my daughter. She answered on the second ring, warm and cheerful, the way she gets when she is expecting forgiveness before it has been offered. I asked her one question. I kept my voice level. I asked whether Marcus's sister had already been in contact with the cruise line. She hesitated. Then she said she thought so, yes, just to confirm their cabin preferences. I said, I see. Then I told her I loved her, and I hung up. I opened the laptop and logged into the portal. I was the sole account holder. No authorized users, no co-signers. The account was mine, the way the deed to this house is mine. The way Robert's watch on my nightstand is mine, completely and without negotiation. I clicked through to account settings. There was a function called Booking Suspension, a single toggle. The description read, activating this setting will immediately suspend all reservation access and disable all linked billing authorizations. All currently booked services will be placed in hold status. No external parties may modify, confirm, or access reservations during suspension. I moved the toggle. I did not respond to any messages from my daughter that week. She sent 3 texts, each slightly more urgent than the last. The first said, "Hey, just checking in." The second said, "Mom, Renee is asking about the cabin confirmation. Can you ring the cruise line?" The third said, "This is getting strange. Can you please just let us know everything is fine?" Everything was fine, just not for the people who expected it to be. I rang Gloria first. She answered from the food bank, and I could hear cardboard boxes in the background. I told her I was taking her on a cruise in 6 weeks, and that she didn't need to bring anything except herself and one good dress for the formal dinner night. She said, "Dorothy, what?" I said, "Caribbean. 7 nights." "Of rest of us," she said. "Are you serious?" I said, "I am always serious, Gloria. You know that." Ruth cried. Hazel said she needed to sit down, then rang me back 10 minutes later to say yes, absolutely yes, when do I pack? And Lynn asked 3 times if there was a catch, and I told her the only catch was that she was not allowed to spend the whole trip worrying about everyone else. Lorraine drove up the following Saturday just to hug me in person. Cecile, when I rang her, said, "Dorothy May, your Robert always did say you were the one who knew how to love people right." I had to step outside onto the porch when she said that. The magnolia tree in the front yard was blooming. The air smelled the way it does in April in Savannah, warm and green and full of something almost like hope. There was one call I did take. It came from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, it was my son-in-law Marcus. He did not begin with pleasantries. He said, "Dorothy, I know you're upset, but this has gotten out of hand. My sister flew in from Phoenix for this trip. She rearranged her whole schedule. If there is a problem with the booking, you should have said something instead of going silent." I listened until he finished. Then I asked him one question. I asked whether he had paid for any portion of this cruise. A long pause. He said, "Well, we were planning to contribute once everything was confirmed." I said, "Marcus, this trip was booked, paid for, and confirmed 8 months ago by me, in full, under my name, with my retirement savings. And your sister was added to a passenger list I did not authorize and was never asked about. He said it was not supposed to be a big deal." I said, "I knew that was the whole problem." I wished him a good evening and ended the call. My daughter sent one final message the night before we flew. It was the most honest thing she had said through this entire ordeal. She wrote, "Mom, I know we messed this up. I know Renee was wrong, and we should have talked to you first. But the kids are excited, and the flights are booked, and I don't know what you did with the cruise reservation. But if you could just fix it, we can sort everything else out when we get back. I promise. I read that word and thought about Robert in the garden. I thought about the pruning shears still in his hand. I thought about every lunch I had skipped, every haircut I had done without, every 200 pounds I had transferred into that account, alone, quietly, in the name of a promise I had made to a man who was no longer here to see it kept. I thought about the fact that my daughter had not once, in any of those texts or calls or voicemails, said the words, "I am sorry." I did not reply. I set the phone face down on the nightstand beside Robert's watch, and for the first time in 4 years, I slept through the entire night without waking once. We flew out the next morning. 6 women at the Savannah airport. If you have never seen a group of women over 60 moving through a terminal with matching luggage tags and absolutely zero apology in their posture, you have missed something genuinely beautiful. Cecile wore a red hat with a wide brim that she had bought specifically for the occasion. Gloria had painted her nails the color of sea glass. Ruth carried a tote bag with the word finally printed on it in iron, on letters, because she said she had made it herself the night before, and she did not care if it was tacky. On the ship, when we walked into the staterooms and Cecile stepped out onto the balcony and stood at the railing and looked at the ocean for the first time in her 81 years, she did not say anything for a long time. She just stood there, with her hands on the rail and the salt air moving through the white of her hair. Then she turned to me and said, "Dorothy, I wish I had more years left to do this again." I said, "Cecile, that is exactly why we are doing it now." We ate dinner that first night at a long table in the main dining room. I placed Robert's photograph at the center of it, the one from our anniversary dinner where he is laughing at something I said, and his whole face is lit up from the inside. The faces around it were not the ones I had originally planned. They were better. They were women who understood what it meant to have spent your life filling other people's cups, and to sit, finally, at a table where someone had thought to fill yours. Hazel gave a toast that she had clearly rehearsed and was pretending she had not. Not for anyone in particular, just because the mood moved her and there was no one present who would ask her to stop. Each night, we gathered in the common room of our connecting staterooms and shared something, not therapy, not testimony. Just stories, the ones women carry for years without telling, because there has never been a quiet enough room, a patient enough audience, a moment uncrowded enough to let them surface. Gloria talked about her marriage and the years she spent making herself smaller to fit inside it. Ruth talked about her youngest child and how she had learned, slowly, that love is not a guarantee of return. Hazel, who I had known for 20 years and thought I knew completely, told us about a painting she had started and abandoned in her garage, a landscape unfinished for 11 years, because she kept telling herself there was no point. I told them about Robert, about the travel magazines with folded corners, about the red pen circles around Caribbean roots, about the pruning shears. Nobody tried to comfort me with the wrong words. They just sat with me in the truth of it, the way women who have lived long enough to understand grief will do, quietly, without trying to fix it. On the 5th night, we had our formal dinner. Cecile wore a yellow dress she had bought in 1987 and never had occasion for. She looked extraordinary. I wore the blue one, Robert had always said, made me look like I knew something the rest of the room did not. After dinner, we went up to the top deck. The stars were out in a way that does not happen on land, full and dense and low, as if the sky had been turned inside out. The ocean was dark and enormous and completely indifferent to anything any of us had ever worried about, which I found, unexpectedly, to be the most comforting thing I had felt in years. I had packed a lavender candle without knowing exactly why. I set it in the center of the small table near the railing and lit it. The flame moved with the wind but did not go out. I said, "Robert, we made it." Nobody laughed. Nobody looked away. We stood there until the candle burned low, and the ocean kept moving the way it always has, the way it will long after all of us are gone. The email from my daughter arrived the morning after we returned home. The subject line said, "Just wanted to reach out." She wrote that she and Marcus had done some reflecting, that the situation had got out of hand in ways that were not entirely her fault. But she could see now that communication had broken down and that I had probably felt excluded. She said the children had missed having me there. She said Renee had been difficult and that she herself had been put in a hard position. Then she said she knew I had put a lot into the trip financially and that if I was ever open to discussing it, she thought it might be fair to revisit the money that had been set aside for the original booking, since some of those funds had technically been earmarked for the family reunion. And perhaps there was a way to settle things equitably. I set my coffee mug down. I read the email again, slowly, the way I used to read a patient's chart when something in the numbers did not add up, looking for the part where the apology was supposed to be, looking for the sentence that took responsibility without immediately distributing it across other people's behavior, looking for the simple, unadorned words, "I was wrong, I am sorry, I should have treated you better." They were not there. What was there instead was the word equitably, a request dressed in the language of fairness. She wanted me to consider returning money to a trip she had tried to take without me, using funds I had saved, held, and managed entirely on my own. I thought about Cecile in the yellow dress. I thought about Gloria's sea glass nails, about Ruth's tote bag, about Hazel's unfinished painting, about Emlyn allowing herself a whole dessert without apology for the first time in a decade, about Lorraine singing in the stateroom because the room was finally quiet enough to hold the sound of her. I thought about Robert's photograph at the center of the dinner table, watching all of it. I closed the laptop without replying. I picked up my coffee and walked to the edge of the porch where the magnolia was still blooming, a little past its peak now, the petals going soft at the edges, the way beautiful things do when they have held on long enough. I looked out at the yard where Robert's rosebush was coming back in again, new growth at the tips of the canes, small and insistent, and entirely unbothered by the winter it had just survived. I had spent 4 years building something out of love and sacrifice, and a promise made in grief. When it was taken from me without a word of acknowledgement, I had taken it back, not out of bitterness, out of the simple, clarifying knowledge that love is not a transaction, but it is also not a blank check. She had made it confidently because she had counted on my silence, the way all of us who love too quietly are eventually counted on. She had assumed that my kindness was the same thing as my permission, that my generosity was the same thing as my acceptance, that because I did not make a fuss, I did not notice, and because I did not object out loud, I did not mind. She had forgotten something Robert knew about me from the very beginning. I am quiet until I am not. I did not owe her the money she was asking for, which had never been her money and had never been intended as a gift to fund an experience she had designed without me. What I owed myself was this: the recognition that I had kept the promise, not in the way I had imagined, not with the family I had built, but with the family I had chosen, the one that had formed itself around a dinner table on a ship in the middle of the Caribbean, with a photograph of a man who loved the ocean at its center. That afternoon, I rang Pauline and asked her to start looking at itineraries for next spring. "Alaska this time," she said. "Are you taking the same group?" I said, "Every last one of them, and add a name." My friend from Alabama mentioned she has a friend who just lost her husband. See if we have room. Pauline said she would check. I said, tell her the luggage tags are on me. That evening, I sat in Robert's armchair with a cup of peppermint tea and his photograph in my hands. And I talked to him the way I do sometimes when the house is quiet and I need to say things out loud so they become real. I told him we made it to the water. I told him Cecile stood at the railing and looked at the ocean, and I thought of him the whole time. I told him the rosebush was coming in strong this year, and that I was going to learn to paint, which he would find funny, and I did not care. I told him I had finally understood something he had tried to tell me for 33 years. That love given freely is a beautiful thing, but love given blindly is just a different kind of loneliness. Then I told him I was going to be all right. The candle on the side table burned low, and then out. The room was dark and warm and full of the particular quiet that belongs to people who have finally set something heavy down after carrying it for longer than anyone should have had to carry it alone. I was not someone's footnote. I was not someone's safety net. I was not a wallet with a heartbeat. I was Dorothy May Callaway, and I was finally, completely, irreversibly free.